This is Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond, where stories, science, traditions and new ideas meet. Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond is a podcast of PBB Media, a not-for-profit community media and journalism project. The majority of our team reside and work from the beautiful and profound lands known as Cavanbah, the meeting place, now also known as Byron Bay and surrounding hills, in northern New South Wales, Australia. We acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Arakwal people, the Midwife people, and the Bundjalung people of the great Bunjulung nation, and the many other tribes that frequented this land. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. As a team and organization, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and waters, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land for over 22,000 years, and upon which we now work and live. We acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and recognition of culture, connection to land and waters, and sovereignty for all Indigenous peoples across Australia is a matter of current and vital importance. In this episode, you'll be hearing from midwife, academic, and mother Hazel Keedle on her latest research into VBAC, vaginal birth after cesarean, and women who choose a home birth after a cesarean as well. You'll also be hearing about her personal experience and her experience working as a midwife in the field here in Australia today. I absolutely love this interview with Hazel, and towards the very end we further unpacked some critical aspects of maternity health care and how health consumers experience maternity health care, and particularly the specific variance between what is so common for health consumers when they exit maternity health care. This common feeling of either that their body failed, that they failed at doing childbirth and various other aspects of the perinatal period, or that they come out on the other end feeling triumphant and, as Hazel puts it so beautifully, as a superwoman or superhuman. I highly recommend listening all through to the very end of this podcast to find out more about these very critical aspects and how they play out in maternity care. And even if you are a healthcare provider and a clinician in this setting, how difficult it is to navigate the system. Hazel Keedle is a midwifery researcher and lecturer at Western Sydney University and a PhD candidate. Hazel's been working in midwifery group practices, an Aboriginal medical service, a variety of hospital setting, and as a privately practicing midwife in both city and regional locations. She's passionate about VBAC, following her own experience of having a VBAC with her daughter in 2008, and since then has published research on women's experience of having a home birth after cesarean, and on her PhD work exploring women's experiences of planning a VBAC in Australia. Hazel, again, welcome to the Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond show. We're always interested in interviewing midwifery researchers and especially mothers who have gone through childbirth themselves and then gone on to produce research in this area. Can you tell us a little bit about your own personal experience and how that informed your interest in research?
Sure. So I did my nursing first, and I did nursing for about 10 years. I always wanted to be a midwife, and my granny was a midwife. She told me that I would be the midwife in the family. So I followed her lead and I started my midwifery here in Australia. I'm from the UK originally, but I moved over here in 2002 and did my midwifery quite soon afterwards. And when I was doing my midwifery, I met my husband, and very quickly in my new grad year, I had my first baby. Now, he was a planned home birth because my granny had done the home births and I was very much into the home birth arena. But then he was a unplanned breech. and he ended up being a transfer. That's a whole story on its own, but I won't go into that. I ended up being a transfer into a local hospital that I worked at, so I knew they wouldn't support breech, and I had a cesarean, and I didn't really do very well. It's actually probably one of the most unwell periods of my life, really, because I just about 35 weeks, I think I had pneumonia that I was hospitalized for, and I got really sick with that. And then I was out, and then by 37 weeks I was in labor with him. So then I had all the cesarean, and then a week later I was back in hospital again with endometritis, so an infection inside the womb. It used to be called childbed fever, and used to be a big killer until we had antibiotics. So I was actually really quite unwell during that whole period, and then it really hit me in my mind as well, I think, a month or two afterwards, and then onwards, that I didn't get the birth that I wanted. I felt very disempowered. I felt that I had all the control taken away from me. And yeah, there was a lot there that it just didn't really help my head. Now, we were planning on having another baby within a couple of years, but when my baby was about 6 months old, I kept thinking, why is it sore to breastfeed all of a sudden? And I went and did a pregnancy test, and I was already pregnant. So I had conceived when he was only 4 months old. And that kind of put me into a bit of a tailspin, really, because I thought, well, I assumed I would have a vaginal birth after cesarean. A midwife at the time of my cesarean gave me this fantastic book called The Silent Knife, a real old classic from 1983 about VBAC. And but then I suddenly realized, well, it would only be 13 to 14 months between the babies. And so then how would that impact my decision and my support from healthcare professionals to have a VBAC? So I spent a whole weekend reading papers, and I realized that, having it less than 15 months apart would put me in a higher uterine risk category of around about 3%. I think it's 2.7% chance of having uterine rupture, where everything else is less than 1% if you're not using any drugs. So I was really put out by this, and I came out to my husband and I said, well, that's gone. That's all my plans for VBAC. They're out the window. And he said, why? And I said, well, because I've got nearly a 3% chance of having uterine rupture. And he said, well, but you've got a 97% chance of not. I went, oh yeah, that's true. And I then realised I had a big support in him, and I decided to go for a VBAC. And I did some things that probably weren't great. I avoided all antenatal care. I would go to work, do my blood pressure, get someone to do my blood pressure, listen to the baby, and then I wouldn't really interact with anyone else. I had a friend who was going to be my midwife, and another friend that was going to be my doula. So then fast forward to being in labour, and I had a weekend of being in and out of labour, which was really tough. And then when it all kicked off, my doula couldn't be there. She was with somebody else. My midwife couldn't be there because she had to be somewhere else for family reasons. And I didn't feel like I could do this on my own at home. So I rang up and told them, look, I'm on an unbooked, planned home birth after cesarean. I'm coming in. And I went to the hospital that I trained at, and I had to fight. Throughout the day, I was being told, you're going for a cesarean, and it's been too close between your last baby and this baby. While I was having a vaginal examination, flat on my back, I was told by the midwife who was doing the vaginal examination about a uterine rupture that had happened recently where the baby had died. And so I could not have been in a more vulnerable position at that point. But because I was stubborn and determined, and I knew my research, because I was a midwife and I've read up on it, I thought, no, I'm still going to go for this. And I just kept fighting all day. It was just a battle. And they told me that 4 o'clock on the dot, I was going around for theatre. Not that I'd signed any consent form, because I wasn't, but they kept telling me 4 o'clock on the dot. And then I pushed her out of my vagina, and her birth time is 4 o'clock on the dot. And so I was absolutely determined I was going to have a vaginal birth. I still was fighting to the point that I was pushing, because I was sitting on a birth stool. I had my husband, who's a big man, clamped behind me, sitting behind me, holding me down. And because I said, don't let go. And there were midwives either side trying to lift me up and put me up on the bed, because I said the doctor was in the room saying, you must birth on the bed. But I refused. And I pushed her out on the birthing stool. And I had this amazing experience. And the minute she was out, they were all like, oh, this is great, well done. And I'm thinking, well, that wasn't exactly from any help from any of you here. That was through my own determination. And it left me with a lot of questions. It left me with wondering, how does any woman do this in the system? Because I had to fight, and yet they knew me. They knew me as the hippie home birth midwife. They knew me as a midwife that had trained there. And they still treated me like that. And I had the knowledge, and not as much knowledge as I have now, obviously, but I still had some at that point. How could any woman who wasn't a midwife or who didn't have all that birthing knowledge, how would they manage to achieve a VBAC in the system? About a year later, I was sharing my birth story in a community forum, and I bumped into the amazing Professor Hannah Darlin. She was an associate professor at the time. And I shared my story. She heard it. She said, you need to do research on this. At the time, when I married my husband, I became an instant mum of 3, and then we had 2 more. So I was fully raising 5 children who at that point were still under the age of 10. So it took me a couple of years before I put my application in to do a research degree. And that started me on my journey to do my master's, which was about women's experiences of having a home birth after cesarean, and then now my PhD, which I'm just at the end of now.
Wow, what an incredible story, Hazel. I'm riveted. I'm at the edge of my seat right now. First of all, that's such an intense and beautiful and incredible story. I loved so many parts of that. I loved that your husband was so supportive and had asked that question, that pivotal, critical question, referring to the benefits or to the positive side of the research rather than just the negative side, which is
flipping those numbers.
Yeah, flipping the numbers, which is often absolutely in our sometimes to the point of sickness, highly risk averse. And when I say to the point of sickness, I mean that the risk aversion can actually create problems, further problems. So our risk averse maternity care system, what a wonderful way with such a gentle and simple question to flip the switch on that risk aversion. And so that was a really great part. I was intrigued and fascinated by the fact that you were a hospital midwife in that hospital, and you didn't get the support from your own hospital, your colleagues. And that is a known thing. I've heard that story before, but I'm still so intrigued when I hear it again.
Well, I was actually at that point, I was working in the local hospital. So this one was a bit further away. So the hospital I was working with didn't provide VBAC services. So I knew I had to go to the next one, but it was the next one along that I had trained at, and they're sister hospitals. So they're, that everyone knows each other. I will just quickly add, though, at the point of being in the hospital, I desperately wanted another woman with me, and I'd spoken to a colleague at the smaller hospital who I knew was on shift that day. When I was kind of going, what do I do? And I'd spoken to her. She knew that if I'd come to that hospital, I'd have another repeat cesarean because they don't support VBAC. She was saying, you need to go to this other one, which I knew in my heart. But then when I got down to the hospital, I just said to my husband, I need another woman. And I got him to ring her back up at the other hospital and say, my wife needs you. She wants you to come down. And the manager, so my manager at the time, let that midwife leave her shift early to come down and support me, which I must say that was amazing.
Incredible.
And she turned up, and I automatically went into transition, and I just had all these fears. I just expressed them all to her, like almost the minute she walked into the room. I just was, like, what if I can't do this? What if I can't do that? And I sent my husband out to get a coffee, and I was like, what if I can't do this? And she was just so amazing. And she just looked at me and said, you are the strongest woman I know. If I can do this, you can do this too. And I was like, oh my God, you're right. And so then I just like, get him back, I'm pushing. And she was the one that went into the other rooms to get me the birthing stool. So she went to find me the birthing, because she was watching what I was doing, and I was sitting on the edge of the bed, and then when I get a contraction, I'd squat down low, and it was getting harder and harder for me to stand back up again. And so she was the one that got me the birthing stool, and then sat my husband behind it. So yeah, like I needed another woman at that point, and she stepped in. So I must say, so my actual colleagues in the smaller hospital, hats off to them, because they let her go early so that she could come and support me.
That's such an incredible part of the story. I'm so happy you shared that bit as well. I think that's also really critical. Having the right support, obviously, during childbirth is critical. And also the state of mind. And I'm going to say that what we consider the state of mind is actually the state of the nervous system. We're often looking at a woman going, that's her mind, but it's actually her nervous system. And when you're in fight or flight because you're not being supported and you're being told your baby, there's a chance of your baby dying and a uterine rupture and all of this kind of stuff, and nobody's being supportive, and at 4:00 you're going for a cesarean section, that is in no way, that is a direct route, the highway route to fight or flight for the nervous system. And as we know, when you're in that state, there's more adrenaline, and of course you can't produce the important hormonal structure that helps to bring about an easy birth. And having that woman, the backup, the support, and your husband there, and that confidence in you, that relaxed your nervous system and allowed you to relax into that capacity to birth. And your own, obviously, it's all driven by your own incredible determination. So yeah, just a fabulous story. Thank you so much for sharing that. And
That's okay. I also wanted, I felt amazing afterwards. I had all those negative questions, but I also felt amazing. I felt like I could take on anything now, because I had pushed her out of my vagina in a hostile environment, basically. And I just felt amazing. And all those issues that I'd had after my cesarean, which was only a year beforehand, they were 13 months apart, they were almost gone. I just felt so amazing. And I wanted to know, do other women feel like this? Do other women feel like this? Or is it just me because I've come from a midwife background? Is it just me, or do other women feel like this after their cesarean, after their VBAC as well?
And wow, I'm really keen to find out what you found out.
My first study was the home birth after cesarean study, and I interviewed I think it was 13 women, 12 or 14. I've forgotten now. Isn't that terrible? It is published, so please check up for me. And anyway, I interviewed them all after they'd had their babies, and I really learned a lot from those women. And when I did a thematic analysis, so I did all their interviews, I transcribed them, I looked into the differences and the similarities between their stories. One of the major themes that came out was I felt like Superwoman. And that was in direct response to a question I asked every single woman, which was, how did you feel after your VBAC at home? And that was the response. I felt like Superwoman. I felt healed. I felt amazing. And that was very validating for me. It was like, yeah, okay, I can get this. I get this. But one of the comments a woman said to me was, I just don't know how anyone in the system can do it, because they're even stronger than I am, because I did it in an environment where everyone supported me. I don't know how they do that in the system. And that made me reflect, I guess, on my original reason for doing the research, which was, I don't know how they do that either, because it was really, really hard. And so that led me into my PhD study, which was looking at all women's experiences of planning a VBAC in Australia across all models of care and locations.
What that sentence, I felt like a Superwoman, has brought up for me, is that aspect of how we value women's experiences. And because of that, what informs research and what kind of questions we ask in research, and the innate bias that's been in research, and how that's changing now, how more women are conducting research, and women who've had lived experience are conducting research and asking certain questions, or researchers are taking into consideration women's lived experience and women's ideas around what should be researched and what questions need to be asked. Because if we're only looking at the chance of uterine rupture as the main reason to not have a VBAC, but we're not looking at women's experiences and the impact that that's had on them, and what that later, when they've gone back into their life, the impact of that, we're not looking at the full picture. And that's just one little example. There's a whole host of other things that we're not looking at. And I'm just really curious and what you think about this, and how you've experienced researching as a woman and researching a topic that you think is very valuable, and just reading other research and trying to understand what's missing or what's been done in that research. Do you have any point of view about this?
Oh my gosh, I could go on all day. I guess there's a few things to bring out from that. When I did my first study, which was the HVAC study, I used a feminist methodology. So I started learning about feminist research, and that has gone through into my PhD and had actually a major effect into my PhD because I used feminist research again. Now, looking at it from the feminist perspective brings in a few things. One, it really values the voice of women and puts the voice of women, the experiences of women as the main part. But there's other things as well, like, you know, the researchers sees themselves as equal to women. There's got to be this equality, and that it's not the patriarchal researcher saying, you give me your information and I will do with it what I want. There's always got to be that equal balance as much as you can, because there's always going to be a little bit of unequal balance there because it is a researcher and participant, but to try and bring it down as much as you can. And I've done that throughout my PhD study in various ways. But another thing that I did and that I think really helps with this this balance of, you know, women's experiences versus more quantitative research is by doing a mixed method study. And a mixed method study gives you such a bigger picture. And mixed methods can be done in a few different ways, but it's basically you've got quantitative study parts and you've also then got qualitative. So quantitative is all the numbers, qualitative is the stories and the experiences. You can do one before, you generally do one before the other. You can sometimes do them at the same time. In my study, my PhD study, I did the qualitative first because we needed to know more about the experiences. And from those experiences, I then designed a quantitative survey. But women were involved all the way throughout. So if I talk about the second phase, the first phase, just to jump in with that, I actually looked at all the women's experiences of planning a VBAC, or the qualitative research that was out there, and that included my HVAC study. And I did something called a meta-ethnography, which is a very systematic process of analysing the data that's already published. With quantitative, that's called a systematic review, but in qualitative work, that's called a meta-ethnography. And it's a 7-step process. And what I found from that was that women go on a journey from pain, which was the previous cesarean, to power, which is their VBAC, and that there was an onward journey after that. It had a ripple effect in the community that they'd had their VBAC. So then for the second phase, which was going to be my qualitative phase, I wanted to focus in on that journey to find out more about that journey. Now, this is where I really wanted to get women's voices. But I was also aware that when we ask women after their pregnancy, we were asking them to reflect on something that they've had the major influences in between. So, you know, if you ask someone what went on at 37 weeks, but you ask them 6 weeks after they've had a baby, or they've had the end of pregnancy stuff, they've had the birth, regardless of how they had the birth. Then they've had 6 weeks of craziness with a newborn baby, with lack of sleep, trying to breastfeed and everything else that goes on in those 6 weeks. And then they get interviewed and said, so what was it like when you were pregnant? It's like, oh my gosh, I think I can just about remember that. So what I wanted to do is get data from women and experiences from women while they were still pregnant. And I wanted it to be controlled by women. So I wanted women to be able to choose what they shared with me. So I designed an app with an app developer. I came up with the idea, and I worked with an app developer to design it, where women could make audio or video recordings after every appointment with their healthcare provider. So they didn't have to tell the healthcare provider they were doing this. They could just come home and they could open the app and they could give a recording on how they felt. Like, how did it impact their decision for VBAC? Like, I gave them a few broad questions, but really women did what they wanted with those recordings. And I followed 11 women throughout that. And then I did interview them postnatally as well, just to find out what had happened since and how did the birth go. And it was really important, that study and that part of the study, because women could choose whether or not to do a recording. They could choose whether or not to send it to me. And if they wanted to, they could ask me to delete it. So I wanted women to be in control, and that it was all about their stories. And as the researcher, I was just grateful to receive them. So then once I did get all that, and I got over 50 recordings and plus interviews, I put them all together into individual stories. and I compared the stories. I did a narrative analysis, so I really looked at each of the full stories from all of the recordings and the interview to get a really in-depth understanding of, what are women going through during pregnancy? What are they being told? How is that impacting them? And what's the relationship with, with their healthcare provider like? And it was from the data from that I then used to design a survey, which came out from the 4 factors that were important, and we can go through that in more detail later if you like. But then those 4 factors designed the survey. But I didn't just stop at that point. I then wanted women to be involved in the survey design. So once I'd put together the survey and I put in some validated measures and a few other things in there, I then invited women to come and test the survey. And so I did it online because, this is pre-pandemic, so I could have done focus groups, but I knew that I'm asking women who this would affect. So they've potentially got children, most likely have got children, and it would be much easier to do an online focus group. So I did online focus groups. I did about 4 of them. I had heaps of women come along to them. They all had access to the pilot survey, and then they came on and we went through the survey question by question, and I got anyone who was on the focus group to give me their feedback. And I wrote it all down, I recorded it, and then I went back to the survey with all of the suggestions and feedback that women had given me. So by the time the survey went out, it was really owned by the women that had helped me design it, who were all part of the target group. And then I had a fantastic response to the survey. Women from every state and territory in Australia did the survey and shared it online, and it was a really good response. And so I really feel that all of these papers that I've published, including this most recent one, it wasn't just from me as this researcher in an ivory tower going, this is what I want to know and this is how I'm going to do it. It was very much owned and done in collaboration with women. And as a feminist researcher, that is really important. And I think coming right back to what you were originally saying, as a researcher, I think we need to think about how we're doing the design. Who is it for, and how can we bring those people in to help with the design? And by doing mixed methods means we can get both sides of the, or we can really explore in depth the issue that we're looking at.
Wow, I love that. So powerful. And, I think, first of all, I commend you and congratulate you for completing such incredible research and such important research as well.
Thank you.
And for taking the time and effort to really understand what women's experiences are and design the research. What's coming up for me is informed research. What you're doing is research that is informed by lived experience, that is informed by what's needed on the ground, that is informed by the value of the experience of the people that the research is about. And I think that's often, way too often, missing from research. And the impact of that is undefinable, really. It's what we're living in. We're saying we can do all of these things, and because there's research to back it up. But that research is incredibly lacking. When research like this comes out that is informed by a very wide and broad range of understanding of what's important in research and what is valuable and what's needed, then the picture looks very different. And so, Hazel, what were those 4 factors that came out from this fertile ground of understanding what was important for women? What were the 4 factors?
Sure. So these 4 factors are what they really impact how a woman feels after her birthing experience, regardless of whether she had her VBAC or whether she had a repeat cesarean in labour. And those 4 factors were having control, having confidence, having a relationship, and having active labour. Now, what I mean by those is, so having control would be how a woman feels about her choices, her wishes, and her outcomes. How in control did she feel about those? Then with having confidence, there is not only the confidence that the woman has in her own ability, which is really difficult when you're planning a VBAC and you've never had a vaginal birth before, because how can you really be confident that you can do this when you're doing something you've never done? So, that it's very tricky with women planning a VBAC, is this confidence issue. But the other part of the confidence, which came out in the qualitative work, and then I actually asked it in the survey too, and it came out as very important, is how confident you felt your healthcare provider was in your ability to have a VBAC. And it's a bit of a confusing way to look at that, but if say you had a midwife or a doctor, and if you felt that they were confident in you to be able to get this VBAC, then that would have an effect on you, and you would then feel more confident about being able to achieve it, because the people around you and the really influential person around you, the one with all the knowledge, is also confident. If on the other side you've got someone who really just does not make you feel that you can even achieve it, who are forever putting up hurdles, is using language that isn't very convincing that they believe that you can do it either, then that's going to have an effect on your own confidence. How do you feel that you can do it if the person that you're coming to for all the advice and information doesn't think you can? So that was an important part of having confidence. Then having a relationship is exactly that relationship with the provider. Now, these are all kind of scaled. So the higher you are, the more likely you were to feel amazing after your birthing experience. The lower you are on these, the less likely you're going to feel, or you're more likely to feel disappointed after your birthing experience. So being high on the relationship factor would be potentially having continuity of care with the same person. But it's more than that. And certainly that's what's come out in the survey as well. It's more than just having continuity of care. It's having a trusted, respectful and equitable relationship with that healthcare provider. And that's really an important part of it. And so if you are feeling higher on that scale, you've got this really good relationship with the healthcare provider, and you feel that you're kind of on this journey together. And then the last part, being active in labour, was actually kind of the pivotal one of all three of them, because you can be as planned as you like, you can be as confident and in control, but then what happens in labour is the be-all, because that obviously impacts the birth that you have. And so women that were more active in labour, so this is in the narrative analysis I did, women that were more active in labour, regardless of their birth outcome, felt better about their birth outcome, almost in a way that they had done everything they could to achieve a VBAC. They had been active, they'd been upright, they'd avoided pain relief up until the point that they needed it, or avoided it altogether. They used all the tools that they learned during their pregnancy. They learned about all the active birth stuff that they could do. And if they did all of that and they ticked all their boxes, one, they either had a VBAC, or if they had a repeat cesarean, at that point they could reflect and go, well, I did the best that I could in that situation. I gave everything a go, and I feel okay with the decision because it was because of X, Y, and Z. It wasn't because I wasn't active in labour. Compare that to a woman who, for whatever reason, like she was unable or unsupported to be active in labour, then that left the woman with a lot more questions of, well, maybe I should have done this, and what if I'd done that, and I didn't do this, and I did this, and that may have led to this. So a woman was more likely to feel disappointed afterwards. So there were those four factors. It was having control, having confidence, having a relationship, and having active labour. Once we'd got those four factors, and that's what came out of following these women through their journeys and postnatally as well, I looked at doing the survey, which was going to be the quantitative part, the final part of the PhD. And I wanted to use those four factors and test those four factors to see whether it can be tested on a bigger field. Is this actually something that is really important for VBAC research and for women planning a VBAC? So I designed the survey around those four factors, and I've brought some different things in. There's a couple of Canadian measures, the mother on decision making and mothers on respect. I used those. There's a few other things that we brought in. Like I said, we did the focus groups on the questions as well, but they were basically around those four different factors. And then when I was actually analysing the data, one of the things I wanted to look at, because I asked this in the in the questions, not only did I ask women, who was your healthcare provider? And there was a whole list of different types of ones, and they could put in other if they wanted. The most important question for me was, I asked them, did you have continuity of care? And I put a little definition, that being the same person throughout pregnancy, labour and birth, and postnatally. And then they could answer yes with a midwife, yes with a doctor, or no standard care. And that was really important because this was from the woman's perspective. So this isn't me looking at a list of different healthcare providers and saying, well, that one's continuity of care, that one isn't, blah, 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 because that's my perception and understanding of it. But if the woman felt that she had this particular model, but she didn't get continuity, or that she did, then she's answering it very differently to how I'm looking at her answers, if that makes sense. So then the question about, did you receive continuity of care? Yes with the midwife, yes with the doctor, or no. That's what I did all of the analysis based on. Because then again, as that feminist researcher, as being women's voices, this was women's perspective of whether or not they had continuity of care. And I kind of want to emphasize that point because I think it's really important. So then I looked at the experiences of women in those 4 different factors compared to whether or not they had continuity of care with a midwife, with a doctor, or with standard fragmented care, which is basically seeing whoever that you need to see when you turn up to your appointment. It was fairly equal out in those different groups. I had a few more women that had continuity care with a midwife, but when you then add statistical analysis, it kind of all brings it down to being equal anyway. And what I did find was that women who had continuity care with a midwife, they felt more in control. They felt more confident, and they felt that their midwife was confident in their ability to have a VBAC, both during pregnancy and during labour. They were more likely to be active, so there were more upright births, more upright positions, more active labour resources used, and a much higher likelihood, and statistically significant with these as well, chance of being upright and also for having a water birth with a midwife. And then the relationships as well. These were ones where women scored higher on feeling that they were being treated with respect if they had continuity of care with a midwife. And so those relationships were more built on trust and respect. So if we then compare those 3 models, and this is where, if you look at the paper, there's these little fancy little graphs that are plotted. And this is where my husband, the environmental scientist, came in, because I said to him, look, in my head, I'm assuming continuity care with the midwife and the doctor is pretty much the same. Like, I can kind of see the figures are a bit different, but I reckon they're about the same. And then standard fragmented care is much lower, but I can't, like, all I can see is all these numbers. I can't visually see this. Like, what can I use to do this? And he said, well, in climate change modelling, we would bring that together and we would do confidence intervals and we would do all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, okay, I still don't know what you're talking about, but here's my Excel spreadsheet. Tell me, like, have a go and see what you can do. Hence, he's on the paper, because he then put all that information into these graphs and showed these really amazing graphs that showed you the impact of the different models of care for each of those 4 factors and then overall. And then when I saw those, and I guess this comes into a little bit about the bias, because maybe people might think because I'm a midwife, I would expect and I would put a bias on the fact that midwifery would come on top. But from all the stuff I'd done from the narrative analysis to this, I didn't think there would be as much difference between continuity of care with a midwife and doctor that there was. When I looked at them, I was like, oh, wow, they really do show a difference in each of those 4 different factors. And that's what's really novel about this study, and what's really important about this study, is that we've looked at continuity of care with a midwife. We've looked at continuity of care and the benefits that it can bring. And we've got some very, very large randomized controlled trials that show the benefits of that. But we have little research that actually looks at the differences between continuity of care with, say, a midwife and with a doctor. And that's what this study is a bit brave and looks at. And that's where those graphs really help, actually looking at that. So we looked at different questions and different tools that we use in the survey for each of those graphs. And yeah, so the continuity of care with a midwife really is an important relationship that helps a woman feel more in control, feel more confident, and more likely to have an active labour and birth.
Amazing. And I love that. I love that that's what's come out of the research to further support this important work of midwifery. And just as you said, I mean, the bottom lined it with your own experience where you're facing a VBAC in the hospital and you just knew you needed another woman with you to come who was a midwife who could support you to do what you knew you already could do, but you needed that extra support and that confidence building and the connection with another woman to say, yep, I'm here, I'm backing you, you can do this. It's not that you couldn't do it, it's that you needed the extra support to do that. And it's not to say that every woman needs that, but the power and the relevance of that and the value of that is really shining through in this research. And I love that as well.
Well, historically, that's what we did. And not even historically, in many cultures around the world, this is what you would do. You would have had the woman in the village or in your settlement that was knowledgeable about labour and birth, and you would be supported by other women who have birthed, who have been through that experience and could support you. So it's not new information really. It's almost coming back and going, yeah, well, we did it right. And there are many cultures around the world that are doing it right now. This is something that you need wise women around you to support you to do that. Now, this isn't to say you shouldn't have men there, or you shouldn't have your partner, or you shouldn't have someone there that hasn't had a birth, because there are many midwives that come into that category, into many of those categories, and support people that do as well. But it does put the focus and the importance on that relationship with someone who you know, who you trust, and who has that knowledge and has that belief that you can do that.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people might think, well, why don't we have that anymore? And clearly maybe that wasn't working and that's why it finished. But it's actually, when people look further into the history of maternity care and obstetrics, and we find a lot of things that are not very nice, a couple hundred years ago and decades ago, of how women were criminalized from practicing midwifery with other and being with women. That happened in the United States when the healthcare system became industrialized. So many different things that we don't quite know about these things, but they've had an impact through the loss of connection for women with women, midwives with women, and then that had to be rebuilt over time. And it's not a discussion for now. But what I did remember at the very end of the discussion was what came up in that previous interview and came up here again, and that's what's shining through your research as well, and why it's so important is often research that doesn't take into account the lived experience of women and their points of view and ideas and what's valuable to women and what's important to them, leaves us with research that points to minimalized and minimized realities. And often women walk home feeling that their bodies have failed.
Absolutely.
And that to me is the larger crime. So, out of the experience itself is one thing, but the women then believing that their bodies had failed is a whole other level of crime that we send women home every day. Today, at this moment, there's a woman somewhere going home thinking, my body failed. There was something wrong with my body. So going back to the very beginning where, had you had support with your first baby to have the breech, had there been a fantastically supportive breech team at the hospital that you were birthing that had supported you to have a vaginal breech birth, even though you were unwell, who knows, you might not have needed a VBAC. Although I'm so happy in many ways that experience came down your way, not because I'm happy that you had the cesarean, but also because this led you to create such phenomenal and fabulous research.
There was a pivotal moment actually when I was in at the hospital, because I was in labour. And the obstetrician did an ultrasound just to double check it was breech. And he was a little boy. And because I was only 37 weeks. And she said to me, and to the midwife that was there, she said, this baby is in the perfect position to have a breech birth. He is, his bottom's down, his feet are up, he's little, he's in a perfect position for vaginal breech. Let's go for cesarean now. And at that moment, you know, like I could have just walked out that room and gone, no, right, well, I'm going to just do this at home. But, you know, there's so much more to it. And I just remember her saying that. I remember how she said, this is the perfect breech birth. And then there was another time
it could have been so easily turned the other way. This baby's in a perfect position for a vaginal breech birth. Let's go ahead.
I know, exactly.
And then that's exactly how the research is used by a care provider in that moment to turn woman, your body is failing, to woman, your body can do this. You're built to do this, and we're going to support you to do this, unless it becomes extremely obvious that we cannot. And woman goes home feeling that her body couldn't do it, that there was something wrong with her, versus woman going home with, oh, well, this is just a variation of normal, or this was just how, my body went through this incredibly demanding experience, and I came through the other end feeling like Superwoman.
One other thing that happened just after my cesarean, the doctor came in and she was doing the whole debriefing thing. Don't get me started on that. That's the whole area I'm looking into now. But she said to me, you got to 8 centimeters.
Oh my goodness.
And she said, when just before I did the cesarean, I did a vaginal examination and you were 8 centimeters. And she said that as if it was a really positive thing, because, I think what she was trying to come across was that's good for VBAC, right? Because you can dilate, your body can do this.
Oh.
But what I took from that was I had even less control. You did a vaginal examination without consent.
You didn't inform me of the results of the visit.
Yeah, you didn't tell me I was 8 centimeters. You didn't give me the option to say, stop the cesarean now. I'm 8 centimeters. I'm going to push this baby out. And I just, it was, when I reflected on it, it was like, wow, not only did you do that without any consent, because you didn't even ask if you could do that. You did something to my body without asking me. And I didn't feel, which, is a very gray area, looking at consent and assault. But then actually I could have made another decision. That information could have really impacted me at that point. And you took that away from me as well. So look, the survey, in the survey, there wasn't all really, really positive stuff. Like, I haven't been able to publish everything at this point that's in the survey, and there's papers in the making. And one of them is going to be looking at a lot of the text entries. So there were qualitative responses throughout the survey. And one of the questions I asked was, did you receive hurtful comments during when planning a VBAC? And the majority of women did receive hurtful comments. And I spent some time recently going through those hurtful comments, and I'm still affected by them. They made me cry. Some of the comments were just disgusting that women were being told. And this is current because women only did the survey last year, and then they were asked if they had planned to be back in the last 5 years. So this isn't, a long time ago. And some of them were actually currently pregnant at the time. So they were getting those comments just last year. Those comments were disgusting. They were horrible, and they were at different levels as well. So there was the death and dying, but there was a lot that you'd been mentioning about failure of body parts, and the impact that has, which is a whole level of body shaming that is going on by saying these parts of your body don't work, therefore you can't have a VBAC, and the power that's involved in those hurtful comments. So that's a paper I'll be working on later this year to put together, to really look at those experiences of women, because it wasn't all sunshine in the survey. There was a lot of deep stuff that came out as well.
Wow, I'm absolutely excited and can't wait to see the results of that and to hear more about that as well. Really, all power to you, and beautiful. And I've loved this interview today. We've touched on all the most important things that we love to talk about at pregnancy, birth, and beyond. Women's health and well-being. The importance of agency over our bodies, human rights in childbirth, so many different things in here. And also research that is informed by lived experiences and informed by women's experiences.
to follow on the feminist research that I've done in a PhD, part of that is getting the research back out there for women to be able to know about this. Now, thankfully, my research is published in an open access journal, so anyone can access the paper. I've been able to do things like this, the podcast interviews, and there's a few media articles that have come out and are coming out on this. But I have also put together this little Facebook page just called Hazel Keedle, VBAC Researcher. And in that, the aim of that page, and there isn't very many videos and I will continue doing them, is to make little videos, 2 to 3 minutes long, that break down some of the VBAC research out there. So some of the videos are my own, about my own research, but others are about things like a VBAC after multiple cesareans and other topics like that, to share with women in a I guess it's called translational research, isn't it? Getting it back out to women so that they can understand it and then they can help them make informed decisions. So I am reachable on that. You reached out to me on that, and I want to share that because I love getting comments and getting feedback and getting messages on that. I had a beautiful message not that long ago about a midwife about a woman who, in an appointment with an obstetrician, she made the obstetrician watch one of the videos. So I think all power to her. That's awesome. Who knows what the response was or what the obstetrician thought about the video, but still, they're there to really help.
2 to 3 minute videos can be so powerful in terms of both in those scenarios, but also in getting across such potent messages that, as we can see, have taken so long to create and so long to get really unpack and right into the nitty gritty of it and what it all means. That it's wonderful that you're creating that. And so where can we find that again? Is that on Facebook? What's the name of it?
Yeah, on Facebook. I think if you put @VBAC Matters, it comes up, but also Hazel Keedle, VBAC Researcher. You'll find it that way as well. So I do just want to give credit to my amazing supervisor team, which is Professor Hannah Darling, Professor Virginia Schmid, and Dr. Elaine Burns. I got that team for my master's and I made them stay on for my PhD. I said, you're not going anywhere. You're my A team. And they have been amazing. But also just for the final paper for my PhD, the last one, I also want to give credit to the amazing Lillian, who was our epidemiologist and saved me with all the stats and taught me a lot. And also my husband Warren, who was also on that paper. So I've had some amazing helpers, but yes, certainly a big thank you to my amazing supervisors.
So don't forget, you could get 8 ACM CPD points for this. There are likely to be 1 CPD point for this hour-long podcast. Hazel, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. It's been great.
You've been listening to Hazel Keedle, the VBAC researcher, on the Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond show. I'm Annalee Atia. You can find out more about our work at pbbmedia.org. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please rate and review us on iTunes and wherever else you are listening to this podcast. It helps to increase people's access to this podcast. If you think it's important for others to hear this information, please do so. We'd love to hear from you. You can get in touch with us through our email hello@pbbmedia.org.